Welcome back, everyone. Next up, we have Sian John. Sorry, Sian, that technology didn't play ball for you to open our conference as we had planned. For those who don't know Sian, she is the Chief Security Advisor for EMEA and AP for Microsoft. But we first met Sian back in, I think, 2007, when she was just Sian. Long before she was honoured by Her Majesty the Queen, now Sian John MBE. We have to make a fuss of that every time we talk to Sian. To say that Sian is one of our influential COSAC supporters would be an understatement, I think. Amongst other things, Sian is the chair of the Tech UK Cybersecurity Management Committee and the chair of the Digital Economy Advisory Board. But to us, she's just our beloved Sian from COSAC, who always pushes the boundaries, always has something interesting to say. Just before Sian takes the stage, have a look at the poll about the core drivers for your organization's digital transformation while Sian is speaking. Sian, lovely to have you with us at last. Over to you.
Great, thank you, David, and sorry for the problems this morning. I unfortunately showed the downside of an evergreen approach to technology. So my webcam updated at 8 o'clock this morning, and that obviously broke everything. So I'm now using effectively fully Microsoft technology. So I was throwing at Microsoft, but it turns out it wasn't Microsoft's fault. So what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is really, I think we've done quite a few buzzwords in terms of the zero trust discussion. So I thought I'd do another one around digitally transformed world. So in a way, it's quite good that I could go after having watched Chris's zero trust session, and as David said, it's quite right that Andy opened the conference with his experience. So this is a conversation that we have a lot in terms of talking with people in that, you know, everyone's talking about digital transformation. We're talking about what we're going through it. The reason for this question that I'll come to in the poll is it's a conversation we've been having from Microsoft for a long time in terms of, you know, with customers, how do you get through a digital transformation? How do you change the way you do technology? How do you change the way you engage? And how does that actually affect security? And in reality, a lot of the security approaches, some of the things we were talking about in the last session, are what are holding organizations back from digital transformation to some extent because of the way that security has been done for the last 20, 30 years. It was fine in the sort of older world, but now as people are starting to do things more digitally connected, there's some real issues with that. So yes, this is why I'm asking you this core driver, because we have a lot of customers that we've been working with that are doing digital transformation on that journey. Some are near the end, some are at the beginning, some are at the middle. And what we found personally was there was a massive increase in the amount of people that had to do digital transformation in February and March this year, when effectively you had to send people home, and the traditional ways of doing security in particular, where everything goes through the corporate network, just really struggled and couldn't cope. And what we found was the people that were further on that journey were the ones that actually were more capable or had a quicker adjustment to the change. So that's really one of the conversations from that perspective. But let's talk a little bit around some of the sort of core things behind digital transformation. And we sometimes talk about digital transformation as if it's this new thing. And sorry, you should know, anyone knows me knows I've got no artistic skills, so I always nick my whichever company I work for slides to use for different versions. So apologies for the automation here. But really, digital transformation is just that latest change in terms of what we're doing. So effectively, you started off with the sort of first industrial revolution of the steam engine, mechanical water, mechanical production, etc. Then you got into the sort of division of labour, mass production, and then the electronics transformation effectively. And then now when we're talking about the digital transformation or the fourth industrial revolution or whatever you might be, it's really that divide between physical and digital really getting blurred. So you can't necessarily say this is something that happened to the physical world, this is something that happened to the digital world. There's a back and forth between it, which obviously means that technology is becoming more and more important, and so is the securing of that. So one of the things that people talk about now in terms of we've had that blurring the physical and digital divide, the thing over the next few years is actually how can we go for almost reclaiming the personal? Because as we've moved through all these different revolutions, we've moved away from being a personal interaction. So if you went back to before the steam age, everything was, you went to a local tradesman, you got local approaches, they understood who you were, you got a really personal service. Whereas what a lot of people are trying to do now is look at how you can reclaim that personal, allow people to have some personalized, customized service, how you can make that context aware. And I don't just mean in the security terms here, I mean in terms of actually, when I give you something, I can actually understand the context in which I'm giving you that service or that product or that engagement and how you deal with it. But the challenge we've got is, how do we do that without being creepy as organizations? And how do we do that in a way that protects the privacy of those that deal with us? So when we talk about digital transformation from a business perspective, quite often it's about how do we engage with customers better? How do we understand what they're doing? How do we understand how to operate with them? How do we understand what service might be the best service for them? How do we empower employees to do more? So go away from that lockdown world into a more engaged. How do we optimize the way that we do things? And maybe how do we transform products to make them more capable? So effectively going from that digital transformation, a lot of it's involved along systems of intelligence, whether that's technology intelligence or data around people or actually data around the world, which is where the rise of IoT comes in. So from a technology perspective, there's three things that tend to be driving that digital transformation. Yes, cloud is helping that because it's giving the processing power, it's giving the connectivity, it's giving the openness to do it. Yeah, a reinvention of productivity and business processes, a lot of technology being overhauled and engaged to change to support that, and then creating much more personal computing. And this is where we can quite often, we get a tension between technology and between security. The technology has also got that tension, but they're sort of maybe 4 or 5 years ahead of security in terms of having to make that change, sometimes depending on the customer. So what does this equate to in terms of real impact? One is the fact that it's a much more complex world to secure than it used to be. It's a much more complex environment. So we have much higher consumer expectations. And the example I always use of this is if you think about banking, and mostly because of my age, if I have any bills, my bills don't come out of my bank account until 3 days after I get paid, because I'm used to having to go through clearing and wait for the checks and things to clear back when I first started working a long time ago. That's just not something people do now. People expect to buy a car almost with Switch. People expect to just transfer money and it be available immediately. People take their bills out the same day. So when you actually have an issue, the expectation from the consumer is a lot less understanding around the fact that suddenly if a banking system is not available, you've got to look at any of the sort of banking outages over the last few years. The major impact that had on the world was because people really expected things just to be there in a way that they didn't necessarily do that a few years ago. The other side of it, though, is the massive pace of innovation. We can do so much more, so much quickly. The challenge is making sure we do it in a constructive way and in a way that doesn't expose the organization to greater risk. And for those that don't digitally transform, there's quite often an existential risk because you have digitally native competition coming in to actually go after their customers and deal with them. So we see that in retail, we see that in banking, and we even see that in travel. So, there's a company that's just struggled and went out of existence last year called Thomas Cook, 200-year-old travel company. Great offerings. One of the comments around that was that they still were connected to bricks and mortar and going in and seeing a travel agent, whereas the way a lot of people now buy holidays or travel is all through the internet and very digitally. And so they were able to keep up with that control. The other issue that's coming up now, and it's going to come up more, is laws and regulation. So if something happens where the government can't trust them, they're going to regulate more, they're going to put more control in. From whether it's Schrems 2 coming in concerned around data flows with cloud services, or if it's the GDPR from a privacy perspective, or the California Cloud Consumer Protection Act. There's effectively lots and lots of laws and regulations, and the more global you are, the more of a challenge that is for people. So really, how do we actually allow that transformation while supporting the security approach? And this is not a sales thing. So this is just the reason I'm quoting Satya Nadella here is just this is a really core thing, that businesses and users are only going to embrace this new technology only if they can trust it. So I'm not going to read the bottom bit because it's the top quote that I really want to share here. It's that fact that as a technology organization, for us, security has to be perspective. And that, I think that's the same for any organization relying on technology. And as you digitally transform, you must build that in such a way that you mean trust. And when I'm talking about trust here, it's not just about the whole, do I trust this user logging in, zero trust technical approach. It's actually, does the consumer trust you as an organization to handle their data, to deal with them, to actually be a trustworthy organization in terms of dealing with them? And do you trust that user themselves or that consumer not to defraud you or work with you? And this is a really key thing. One of the people I really like to follow when it comes to trust, and this may be a future COSAC talk, or is actually Rachel Botsman, who talks about effectively trust gaps. And so when anyone has to do trust, it's really, you have to go from the known across a chasm of the unknown. You have to go from something that you know to something you don't know. And there's almost like a river, a chasm of uncertainty you've got to jump across. And so actually to make it easy to make that leap, that trust leap, so to speak, you either shorten the chasm, make it narrower, which is effectively what transparency. Everyone says transparency gives trust. Transparency doesn't give trust. Transparency helps to reduce the uncertainty. So it means that there's a smaller leap to get from the known to the unknown, effectively to make that journey, so that jump. So what we've got to look at is how do we help people to make that jump to trust a new and different way of working, that may mean that they've got to change their operation and the things that they do. And that from a consumer side, it's like, do you protect my data? Are you not being creepy? Are you going to do nice things for me? But then from a technology side and from a security side, there's a big trust leap that security professionals have to make, is going from the known on-premise infrastructure to the unknown of using maybe a cloud service or a mobile service or doing file sharing, data sharing, moving away from actually just focusing on the network and putting controls around that. And so there's a number of trust leaps that we've got to make in terms of digital transformation, both from the consumer but also actually from the technology and the security professional side. So just to think about some of the three major forces that happen in digital transformation, and actually I could take the word transformation, digital, out of this and just make it any transformation. If you go back to the invention of the bow and arrow, this probably applies. So the first thing is you realize the value from the new technology. So in the invention of the bow and arrow, I can suddenly shoot, I don't know, woolly mammoths. Then I can maybe realize that I can maybe shoot at the other village and take over the other village. But then there's an increased risk from the new threats that come with this new technology. So with the invention of the bow and arrow, not only can I shoot at other people, they can shoot back at me. So then I've got to think about new controls and approaches of how I'm going to deal with that risk. So effectively, maybe I've got to put armor on to be able to deal with it. And as things escalate through guns and cannons and siege engines, then you get up to the castle models and all that sort of approach. But effectively, every time we have new technology, we always realize the value from it. Then we get the increased risk from the new threats. Then we have to bring in new controls and approaches. And unfortunately, no matter how much we do risk modeling, human nature is almost, we bring out the new technology, we try and model for all the threats we don't know, but there's always that one we didn't think of that somebody out there is able to exploit once it's out there, and then we have to deal with that new control and approach. And when we're actually going into digital, the reality is that you can actually realize that value from that new technology much more quickly. But when you're in something like cloud, your risk will come in much quicker, your threats come in much quicker because it's much more open, much more connected. But the actual advantage as well is if you can build things in a more agile way, you can also bring in the new controls and approaches much more quickly. So you can respond to those things that you didn't expect much more quickly, be more adaptive, which actually can reduce the impact of that threat because you can actually try and counter it a little bit earlier. The core is being able to do that in a timely fashion before your entire organization's been owned. So one of the real problems we have, and I think at the core of the digital transformation and security tension that we get, is that core to digital transformation is enabling productivity. So how do we do that without compromising security? And it is a delicate balance. And I suppose you go back 20 years, we used to talk about the sort of line of secure versus productive, and you make a risk decision, and how productive you got to be was based upon what security tooling was needed to be in place. And I see that still across a lot of customers where, you have 15 security tools installed on an end device, because that makes the security team feel very, very comfortable that they've got the right controls in place. And I have one particular customer where, speaking to the customer, they were saying, the security team were like, we're really happy, we've got the right security controls, we've got what we need in place. And then I went to speak to the head of digital and the head of the digital workplace, and it's almost like you had to get him a psychiatrist couch out, because he was complaining about the stress of this locked down system with so many agents on it that took 14 minutes to boot up. And so they had mobile employees who had to go in and meet with customers, boot up their laptop, ask them questions, fill in the application, and doing financial advice. And what they actually found was that the people that were doing that were effectively using their own device and then going home in the evening, booting up the corporate laptop, and then going in and adding it all in as if they actually done it with the customer. So in an attempt to increase security, what they actually had was people using their own device. And it's almost like the more directly you could see that someone's locked down a system, I can almost draw a direct parallel by how much the user experience is locked down to how much shadow IT you will see in that system. Because users are like rivers, they'll try and find the easiest way down the hill, and if you make it too hard, they're just going to go around you. And I could show you that picture of the gate in the field that everyone knows about till forever. But that's the real core that we've got. So what we really need to do in a digitally transformed security world is look at how you actually build a secure productivity. So you actually put security into the productivity experience. It's not an either or. It's okay, so what level of productivity do people need? What security do I need to put into that? So it's almost starting at the user human computer interaction. It's not starting at, here's how I need to secure it. It's starting at what productivity do we need and how do I actually secure that productivity experience? And that's a real tension that I see quite a lot when talking to security professionals. And actually, I was just reading up on a concept called habitus yesterday, which is about our attitudes and our expectations and the way we interact with the world. It's from a guy called Pierre Bourdieu, French guy, so I can't pronounce his name. And it's a sociologist, and it's about how everyone's experience of the world is different based upon their background and experience. And he did it talking about class systems. So, if you're from a middle class background, you're likely to have a certain job because that's the sort of job that you expect to go get. You're likely to like certain types of music, like certain types of food. Whereas if you're from a working class background, you've got a different lived experience. You're likely to have a different set of tastes. And it's something I'm going to work on next is actually, I think we have a habitus in technology. So those of us that are technologists or security professionals, we have a certain expectation and use and way of engaging with the world, which is not necessarily the one that our users have, and almost definitely not the one that the customers of the organization we're working with have. So that sort of sociological, psychological, human-computer interaction approach, which is core to digital transformation and core to the move of technology, is something that we in security are going to have to really look at quite a lot over the next, I think, year, 2 years, 3 years. I think it's the really big focus, and that is the core of digital transformation: is stop trying to secure everything as if it's one size fits all. Stop locking everyone down. Look at the user case studies, look at the way people work, and look at how you can secure that actual interaction. And so this is a slide that if you've ever seen a presentation from Microsoft, you will have seen, which is a salesy slide, but it's actually one of my favorite slides because I think it actually summarizes one of the issues. So when you go and talk to security people, a lot of people have built their security model around everything being on-premise in the on-premise network. So I'm loath to try and actually do the circling, but if you look at the bit in the middle where you actually have all the on-premise systems, the set of firewalls, and if you've got mobile devices, they're connected in and they come through that on-premise experience, and it's all locked down, it's all controlled, it's in my perimeter, I protect it. Almost the traditional eggshell model of security where you've got the hard perimeter and maybe even the soft center. And if you have a mobile device, that mobile device is a locked down experience. Doesn't matter how cool it is, you're going to get everything locked down, everything controlled, because I want to make sure that I know every single bit of data that's going on that device. Yeah, I'm going to maybe turn off cameras, and in some places that is actually necessary. But it's where actually the sort of technology that's almost the best and the worst name bit of technology fits. And I'm going to mention it because it's not really something that's out there anymore. It's evolved. But if you think about good technologies, which was the market leader of secure mobile stuff 10 years ago, is that concept of, if I've got a mobile device, I'm going to run some technology and I'm going to secure it. And good technologies was absolutely loved by the security team and absolutely hated by everybody else, because it was a really secure experience. But the mail and the calendaring and the productivity apps were designed with security in mind, not with productivity in mind. And so therefore the user experience could be really quite unpleasant in terms of actually how you engaged with it. That's what people want to get away from now, into having much more of a first-class mobile experience. If I've got a Samsung 10 or an iPhone 11 or an iPad or a Surface Duo, which has just come out, or a Surface Pro, I want to have the first-class mobile experience that I actually bought that with, and have that work in a really useful and engaging and a normal way that's just natural. That's the same way that I might use it at home, but with some more security controls around it. And so really it's like, how do we allow you to get the best out of that experience while giving you the lockdown and control? The other challenge as well is the rise of things like SaaS. So yes, Office 365, but Dropbox, Salesforce, Box, Google Suites, ServiceNow, so many services sitting in a software as a service. And even an organization, if they say they have no SaaS services, they almost definitely have one, which is ironically their most sensitive one, because most people have outsourced HR or payroll. And even if you don't use a cloud service, it's a good chance that the people that you've outsourced that to do. And then you've got the whole infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, the AWS's, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, all those sort of approaches people need to connect. And then the Internet of Things, smart factories, smart cities, industrial control systems, mobile devices, not mobile devices, HoloLens type approaches, even everything consumer getting connected as well. Although I'll never understand why people internet connect a toaster, but effectively all this stuff connected. And if you think about it, the perimeter now is not on premise. The perimeter now is around all of this. And one of the things we see is when people go digital transformation, and I'll pick one example just because I work at Microsoft, so I see it. So it's going from Exchange on premise to using Office 365 Exchange Online. So when it's on premise, it's all fine. It just works there. As soon as it goes to Office 365 Exchange Online, people want to proxy it. And they're going to proxy all that traffic going through, as I mentioned on Chris's presentation, decrypting effectively all the traffic between the on-premise and Office 365. And guess what? That creates a really short-term opportunity for proxy vendors, because it's a lot of traffic, because you're effectively now using a proxy to look at all your internal traffic, because it is internal traffic. It's, if I email my colleague Simone, it's still going through Office 365. It's an internal communication. What is the advantage that a proxy brings to you at that point? There are things you can actually put into the cloud service. So obviously I'm going to talk about Office 365, but it's the same thing if it was G Suite. There are things you can put in to detect malware, to detect issues, to actually detect, if there's any identity attacks into the service itself. The proxy is not the right necessary approach at that point. So effectively, how do you do that connection? One of the things we saw quite often is, right, I'm going to do a VPN into the corporate network. Then I'm going to go out through my proxies to go to Office 365 so I can control all the traffic. And whether that's Office 365 or WebEx or Zoom or whatever it might be, what happened in March was suddenly people were sending people sitting out in their houses through a VPN, through a firewall and a proxy back out to their web services. And you suddenly had a lot more people going through your VPN than you had before. So you went from maybe 2,000 people at a time going through the VPN to possibly 40, 50,000. Oh, and they were trying to do web conferencing as well. And not surprisingly, a lot of people's VPN systems couldn't actually cope with that. So if you've actually moved to more of a digitally transformed, possibly even going back to Chris's approach, the sort of zero trust environment, where you're actually looking at the connection, you can actually go directly to that web conferencing service, whether it's Office 365 or we could do natively or Google or WebEx, using maybe cloud access security brokers, cloud proxies, those sort of things. And that's effectively looking at how you need to change the mindset to sort of think my perimeter is what I need to focus on is having the right protection on anything that's in, say, an Office 365 to stop files being shared with people it shouldn't do, stop people from outside the organization accessing files they shouldn't, allowing people to do secure sharing in between, but keeping a protection in place. And that's a mindset change, really, to go from the on-premise to the thinking of your perimeter as not just being your network, your perimeter being everything. And I think that's one of the biggest mindset changes that has happened throughout COVID, is a lot of people that hadn't made that flip have had to now. They've now got to think about their employees' laptop sitting in that employee's house being part of their perimeter, and actually thinking about how they protect that laptop from the network that they might be in the house. And this is where concepts such as a zero trust do fit in terms of, but they're not the be all and end, but it's a key part of this story of actually, if I'm going to move away from my on-premise network, actually, how do I put some context in around any connectivity and put some control? So if you think about how we can do security for the productive enterprise, so one of them is enforcing risk-based access, which you could say that is one of the ways you can, zero trust being one of the ways to achieve that. The other is protecting your data anywhere, not just thinking about it's on my NetApp server on my premises. It's like it has the appropriate rights managed on it. It has the appropriate protection. I can actually make sure that wherever it is, whether it's on my employees' devices, in a cloud service, or shared with a third party, I can protect that data and ensure that my policies stay on it. And then the third one is moving towards more of an automation of detection and remediation. Particularly as we start to build things into the productivity experience, we need to keep that performance and connection in place. And the core of that is actually making sure that that's all integrated together, and that neither of these is working as an island, you're working between them. So if you're doing risk-based access and someone's having a risky login or a risky connection, don't let them go and access your very, very sensitive confidential information, and make sure that you can detect that there's an issue, automatically respond and remediate that as quickly as possible. And so again, I'm not doing a sales pitch for Microsoft here, but this is where the productivity, the sort of zero trust approach, this is where something like a conditional access approach comes in. And it's just building on the conversation in the chat on Chris's session. It's actually looking at, it's not just identity, it's device, it's where you are, it's what application you're using, it's what connectivity you're using, it's how you're authenticating, even then putting some machine learning in about what's normal for you, what's normal behavior, even things like user identity behavior analytics. So am I the sort of person that only ever logs in at certain times and never downloads certain files, and now I'm logging in at different time from a different place, and I'm suddenly starting to download really highly confidential sensitive diagrams at scale? I mean, that could either be because I've been compromised, or it could be because I'm an insider risk. So it's that whole thinking about what does good look like, what is an anomalous behavior, looking at the context, and then applying policies around that, and then effectively thinking about an evaluation engine. And so then when you're thinking about you doing conditional access, and obviously this is the Microsoft diagram, but it's this concept, doesn't matter how you approach it. Obviously we can do it for you, but it's actually about this concept rather than the product. It's not just allow or block, which a lot of people see things as on or off. You could actually think about, no, don't do allow or block, do things like limit access, only allow people to go to, say, public information. So if there's a problem with your device, you may not be able to get to sensitive information, but you might be able to check the train tables or something like that. Yeah, effectively, allowing people to force a password reset if you think the identity is compromised, to use some sort of multi-factor to prove it is who they say they are, and actually using this in such a way that you don't necessarily have to use multi-factor all the time. If you're in a trusted location, in a trusted place, and the context of what you're doing is not risky, then maybe I can let you in without needing a multi-factor authentication before you go there. So this is the whole concept of where the productivity and zero trust approaches come. It's like, how do I actually build that productivity into the security experience and make it seamless when the risk is low? And so whichever technology you use to do it, that's the sort of core. The other thing as well, as we go through digital transformation, is the way that we do security and compliance. So if you think about before the cloud, effectively it's always verify everything before you trust, in terms of actually a development approach. So you've got an app team might write a development thing. It goes through a secure development lifecycle review process. You have an infrastructure review, you have a privacy review, and then it goes to production deployment. Any line of business app going to production has to go through this process, and the backlog of the security team determines how the timeline of when it can get published. And you get the consistent complaint of, I missed my deadline because security didn't actually review and approve my app before it went live, even though I didn't tell them about it until 3 days before I was due to go live. If you actually think about that in a mobile agile and DevOps world, yes, you have a lot of control around. So maybe you zero trust to make sure that only the right dev is accessing the right system, that you've got lockdown, you've got privileged access management, you control that dev's access to the environment, and they probably have less rights in terms of access to that environment. They're less likely to be an admin. They're going to have much more controlled roles rather than having effectively root or a full administrator access to the environment. They do have some empowerment in terms of environment. You give them the tooling to actually be able to check security and check for bugs in their own system. Having rapid release schedules, you have DevOps working rather than central IT, lots of devices, lots of collaboration, and effectively you've almost got to trust that the developer is going to do the right thing, but verify that they're following the policy. But what you do is you say, this is the policy, these are the things I need you to do, and then you get them to verify how to make it work. And that's the one I see a lot of challenges as people move towards, particularly cloud and agile and using a DevOps world. The secure DevOps, and whichever other hype word you want to use, secure DevOps, DevSecOps, there's a very big mindset change for a lot of security teams to do that. And it's about, having security champions, empowering the developer to be secure, and then putting the policies and the guardrails in place to make sure that they stick to it. And that's one of the real challenges that people face in terms of doing it. And actually, this is actually, although this is Azure advice, but this is what our own security team at Microsoft had to go through. So in terms of securing on Azure, they tried to sort of keep a little bit more of the traditional security model when they went in, and they had a lot more simplified. And what they found was they couldn't keep up with the risks. They couldn't keep up with managing the environment. And it was actually creating more risk because of waiting for them to test more controls. So really the new approach, and this is on GitHub for anyone who wants to actually look at this security toolkit and how they do it, is effectively you have governance set by the CISO's office, where they set the security, compliance, and privacy expectations of the enterprise. It's very clear. It's very clearly defined to any developer, and the results of not doing it. Having architecture standards and patterns, this is what a system that's supporting remote access or something like that might need to have in place. Whatever application you're building a sales app or something like this, this is the requirements that you have. But then also giving security tooling to the developers so they can actually check for security bugs. They can scan their own code. They can look to see if there's any issues in their code themselves, because developers don't necessarily want to create insecure code. They're just on a deadline and they make things work. So if you can actually give them the power to be able to find and remove those issues themselves, they will. We have one thing that's not optional is basically a cred scan that anytime everyone's writing code, if it detects that you've actually put credentials into that code, it will be flagged up, and it is company policy that you must respond to that. And you cannot, that there were occasional false positives, but unless you can prove it's a false positive, it is actually a company offence to override a cred scan. So there's a whole thing of, you as a developer, it is your responsibility not to put credentials into an application, and you will be held responsible for that. And then so you have security operations doing things like admin roles, looking at security events, verifying the standards, the vulnerability manager, making it work. But then the DevOps and the apps teams themselves, they actually implement the security requirements. They're responsible to do secure code. They have to monitor their own environment and deal with it. And then, on the cloud service provider, which obviously in our case is us, we're the provider to ourselves, but it's the same for anyone else. It's actually, they look at the secure and compliant service infrastructure and services. They provide the capability, and then you use either native security products in the cloud service or third party when needed to effectively augment any security capabilities you have. And it is just a mindset change from, I will actually set your patterns and I will review, to here's all the tools you need to do something that's secure, and I will actually use some governance mechanism to make sure that you actually comply with it. And just a brief aside from a cloud provider perspective, is as everyone's moving to cloud, there's a common thing of thinking, well, how can I trust the cloud? How do I deal with it? From the point of view of a cloud provider, your cloud provider actually has to inherit every single customer regulation of the people sitting on their platform to make sure that they can provide systems that are allowed to comply, but they also inherit all the customer adversaries as well. So it creates a lot of pressure from the point of view of monitoring what's going on. And actually, when it comes to moving to cloud services, one of the big things through digital, and it's one of those things that everyone talks about, but I actually see people struggle with quite a lot, is the concept of shared responsibility. And that does mean that it depends on what workload you're looking at as to where the responsibility lies. So if you think about things like data governance, rights management, client endpoint experience, the account and access management, responsibility for that is always maintained by the organization themselves, even if you use the tools provided by the cloud service. So even if you were to use Azure Active Directory, our information protection from Microsoft, whatever it might be, rights management, the configuration of that, the making sure it's right, the knowing what the policies are, knowing what sensitive data is, knowing what the rules around access are, that completely remains the responsibility of the organization. And many organizations do forget that. And they go, well, I've got the cloud provider, they'll make me secure. No, they won't. And then you've got things that do transfer to the cloud provider, which is things like the physical host, the physical networks, the physical data center. Yeah. And effectively, that's all the cloud provider's provision. So we consistently get questions about how many fire extinguishers we've got in our data center. It's our responsibility to make sure our data center doesn't burn down. So you need to ask the cloud provider, have you got things in place to make sure that your data center doesn't burn down and you've got availability of the physical environment? Asking us specifically how many fire extinguishers you have, that's not your responsibility anymore. Your responsibility is to hold us to that requirement. And then obviously, depending on service type, whether you get the app configuration, the code and the configuration, or the operating system, these are the different things that you might need to deal with. So no matter what you're doing, there is a configuration control, and I sort of think about it. It's when you put controls in place. So if you look at a controls framework, for instance, from Microsoft, and I'm sure Google have the same, but effectively from our perspective, if you look in our compliance manager, we'll show you what we've done for a control, and then we'll show you have a space what you should be doing for that control in these shared responsibility models, and maybe some suggestions of how you do it. But ultimately, the implementation of your side actually relies with the organization. So things like identity and directory infrastructure, we have a requirement to make sure Azure Active Directory is up to date and that we protect it against denial of service attacks, but you have a requirement to work out who has what role, make sure you're doing access reviews, making sure you're implementing things like just in time, just enough access properly, that sort of approach. And I'm not going to go into this in detail because I think I talked about this last year at COSAC. The other thing that we need to, as we go towards larger data, is look at how we can do orchestration, automation, integration across data. And I think security operations is one of those areas that really is transforming at the moment. You can really see it with much more automation, much more intelligence, orchestration across different systems, and actually really trying to reduce the fatigue and the forensics. Particularly as people do move towards hybrid and multi-cloud environments, you need to connect together signal from lots of different places, not necessarily by putting it all in taking all the raw events into one place, so by sharing events and incidents from different native providers. So looking across an AWS, an Azure, an Office 365, an on-premise environment to actually see what's going across all these different environments. So these are some of the things we've got to do and the challenges we face. And I think we're on a journey for doing that from an industry at the moment. And so I'm just going to finish by talking about an observation of what's really happening in digital transformation. So first of all, we have the market transformation of there's some new scale, there's some new, that whole diagram I was saying is you're realizing the value of some new technology coming in. There's some new approach, some new thing to do, whether that's e-commerce coming in or internet banking or mobile banking or online delivery, whatever it might be. Then the business maybe needs to adapt to stay competitive and do digital transformation. In a way, if you actually look at the restaurant industry in the last 6 months, they've had to go through this to some extent. So you've got, market transformation in terms of you can't go sit in a restaurant anymore. Well, you can now, but you couldn't. It depends where you are, whether you can. but if you're a restaurant and you're allowed to actually do takeaway, but you don't have a takeaway service, suddenly you do digital transformation, and that's where things like partnerships with Just Eat and Deliveroo maybe help people to actually accelerate into that digitally transformed world, where you take what was a come in, sit down experience and make it a connected experience. Then maybe IT has to transform and implement support, and effectively, I move away from the restaurant example now, because obviously you go to Deliveroo, so you don't necessarily need to actually have the technology. But if you would say take an e-commerce, you have the market change, you have the digital transformation of I need to have an online presence, then IT needs to build systems to support that, and maybe that means moving away from the legacy systems to more connected. And then the final bit, the bit we're in now, is that security needs to transform. And as I've been saying throughout this, it's about building security into the user experience, looking at being focused on productivity and security. And that means changing the relationship that the security team has with the wider business. So if it works well, in an ideal scenario, security should be engaging proactively with business and IT to enable initiatives and manage risk. When it doesn't work well is when you hear the comment of, I'm not going to let the business go cloud, that's too risky. Or I'm not going to let the business do that on-premise, that e-commerce system, we just can't do it, the threat is too high. Whereas actually, if they don't do it, there may be an existential survival issue for the business. So it's actually, instead of doing that, making that business transformation you want to do, that digital transformation, that brings this level of opportunity, but it also brings this level of threat. Here are the things you need to do to address that threat if you want to be able to realize that opportunity. And if the threat is just too high against the opportunity, then maybe don't do it. Or if it is a case of, if we implement these things, we can actually put in approaches to allow you to be able to maximize the opportunity. So almost like looking at how we can minimize the threat from something we're doing to maximize the opportunity the business achieves. And this is where things like integration and machine learning, automation, intelligence all fit. Not there on the standalone, but actually to accelerate security and allow it to be part of that digital transformation, and not be I want to do this thing, but I'm not going to do it securely. Look at how you can do it in both a secure and productive fashion and enable the business. And I think that's the journey we're on at the moment. We've accelerated massively on that journey in the last 6 or 7 months. What happened quite often in the early days of COVID is people just had to do the digital transformation, and now security is having to go in and put things in place, because people had to go from that network-centric on-premise approach. The people that hadn't made the move beyond that suddenly had to make it very quickly. So when we talk about the greater risk of working remotely, there is a different profile of people sitting remotely, but there's also the fact that if you built your entire security system on the assumption that people are going to be sitting in a corporate network on premises, and then suddenly they're not, then you have some extra threats and exposures, because you can't necessarily go through that security capability and keep people productive. So that's really my sort of thoughts and conversations around that. So, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Sian, as always. I'm glad you got the technical issues sorted out. Just on that note, I believe you've switched back to single screen. You had lovely multi-monitor setup.
I have monitors. I'm just using my built-in Surface laptop with my other monitor behind it. So
I see. So you can. I was going to, although you referred to the poll right at the beginning of your presentation, I wondered if you had any observations on the results of that poll now that they're in. Can you see the poll results?
Yeah, I can see. Well, it's quite interesting that a lot of people saying customers have actually driven, and I think that goes back to what I was saying about the customer expectations being so high now that people need to have digital transformation. And I think that's actually what's driving it from an organizational perspective. Yes, and I think maybe then COVID-19 has been an accelerator. Yeah. Well,
talking of COVID-19, Professor Andy Clark has a COVID-related question for you. Andy?
I wonder what you were going to say there for a moment.
I was being nice to you.
Welcome back. I'm pleased that your hardware problem resolved itself, or you resolved it, or whatever. Great talk. And as usual, there's just so much in there that my head is still spinning, so thank you. I'm only going to focus on one small thing, and I just welcome your opinion on this. You spoke how COVID has focused people's view of where the perimeter of their systems are. And you said it's at the laptop of the user. I just wonder if there's an opportunity we're missing here where we should really be thinking about the person as well. And one of the reasons I've thought about that is I've spoken to quite a few people working remotely normally when I've been calling them at the bank or whatever, and I've then started asking them questions. And one thing that is quite clear is that they really miss the opportunity to turn to a person next to them and say, that doesn't look quite right. And very few of them actually have the ability to get that nudge. So what's your view as to including the user in that perimeter? It's clearly not straightforward, but actually embracing not just all of our technological thinking, but that of behavioral science as well. Have you got any ideas as to what's going on, and have you got any views?
Yeah, the user is absolutely part of that. So I was always saying the laptop device, but it's actually that it's not just the laptop, it's the fact that that user's sitting in front of it and they maybe got their kids doing homework over their back shoulder and maybe got their smart speaker sitting in the room listening to them, and there's a whole challenge there. And I think that is absolutely core. And I think that's the core of looking at security and productivity. We need to actually think more about the way people operate. I know for us, actually, one of the big focuses we've got at Microsoft, and it's not a security thing, but I think there's a security element to it, is trying to manage burnout. So one of the things we've got with the workplace analytic tools in Office 365 is the ability to look at people's behavior and their brainwaves and how they operate. And we found that there's a lot more fatigue with using video conferencing all day. There's a lot more fatigue with sitting locally. People don't actually have that, ironically, that downtime of the commute anymore. So we're really, and it's a phrase I heard someone else say, and it really resonated, so I've been repeating a lot, is that we're not working at home, we're living at work. And that's having an effect on people and how they operate. And so it's part of the thing we really need to actually think about how we make people better. So, I mean, actually, one of the things, not a security thing, but Office 365 now will actually allow you to book lunch, because people weren't booking lunch and you need time off. And actually, simple little things like that, and making sure that people take downtime. Because if they don't, the stats we're seeing of burnout and people you're not getting the idea sessions in the way you were, but also people are just getting more and more burnt out by sitting at technology all day, and that's when you make mistakes.
Can I just take a bit of an issue with something you just said? Yeah. You said that, so there's this ability to sort of measure people's brainwaves and everything else, which fills me with abject horror if I'm sitting at home that my employer's measuring my brainwaves. But have you done trials where you're measuring comparatively between them working remotely and working in the office?
Yes, and so when I say measuring brainwaves, it's not like Microsoft Teams is measuring.
No, I get that.
We're actually doing it with the academic research. We aren't yet, but we're actually looking at that. It's one of the things. It's basically an academic research we sponsored, where you actually looked at people working in the office with face-to-face interface, and they actually looked at some of their brain patterns around that and their productivity issues. And then you looked at working remotely, and there is definitely, what we're seeing is people working more hours but being less productive, and actually then getting burnout. So what they did with the video conferencing was actually looking at the boxes like we've got now, day in, day out, can actually really, they're showing the impact and the tiring on your brain. I'll find the link and share it for people to share in terms of the analytics that they did, the research. But where it's one of the reasons why they brought in the together mode in Teams is because it's actually more restful to see everyone sitting around the table. It feels more natural, even if the Teams together mode currently makes it look like you're a bunch of hobbits in a lecture theatre. They'll get it better eventually, but it's looking at the way people behave and interact. So I'm not an expert on that, because obviously it's done from a different part of our business, but I think, and actually it's something we're sponsoring academics to research. I think it's something we do need to look into, though, and as we're getting to the 6, 7, 8 months, people are really beginning to struggle now with not going in the office. Yeah. I
mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize this session. There'll be loads of other people wanting to ask questions too, but I'm just thinking that this may just give us an opportunity to, rather than look at fixing a problem, to think beyond the problem, to look at new ways that we encapsulate things in our security thinking, which isn't natural to us because we're not behavioral scientists, but perhaps now we need to work in more interdisciplinary teams. Anyway, sorry, thanks very much.
I 100% agree with, yes, that's what we need to do. We need to get beyond technology into interdisciplinary behavioural as well. Thinking psychology, sociology, absolutely essential to our industry going forward. Okay,
great. Thanks, Sian. Good to see you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you for
Sorry, a no-stage question from Panos. Welcome to COSAC, Panos. So it's a question with a follow-on comment from Mary Dunphy. Panos says, it all sounds to me that the security industry is massively failing people by not being able to follow the evolution of things. Any thoughts on how we can change the approach from being reactive to being proactive for the things to come? And Mary Dunphy made a comment from a US perspective that the lawmakers do not understand the issue and cannot adequately address those issues in legislation.
I do think that's a challenge. It's one of those things where it's one of those debates we get into with lawmakers. Is like they're like, well, technology companies, you shouldn't wait for us to tell you to do the right thing before you do it, and that's true. But you shouldn't let technology companies decide what the right thing is either. So we actually need. I know it's something that Brad Smith, the chief legal officer of Microsoft, is very, very active on. He's like, yes, we as technology companies need to behave actively, ethically, and do the right thing. But you know what? It's not, don't just let us define what the world looks like in the future. You actually we need people, citizens, governments, businesses, all to work together to decide what does good look like. So it's that whole, and the big example is privacy and using of personal data, and you can go Cambridge Analytica, whatever it might be. But it's like, when you're going into personalization of services, if I go into the same restaurant every week and they know that I have, I don't know, chicken Alfredo, a glass of wine, and then a tiramisu, and they give me that, I'm not going to feel creeped out by it. If I suddenly go to a website I've never been before, I turn into a restaurant I've never been before, and because they profile me, they go, oh, we know you like chicken Alfredo, a glass of wine, and a tiramisu, I'm going to be completely freaked out by that. And that's why I summarize a lot of what we need to do from a technical perspective is, we're doing digital transformation, is just don't be creepy. Yeah, and that's where we need as an industry to help define what creepy looks like.
Well, I think you have, I know you have interests in human development and so on, but one of the things that fascinates me about your comment, from the perspective of one of the world's largest vendors, don't let us define what is right, you should tell us what is right, which is okay if I'm in Northern Ireland, and only Northern Ireland, but Microsoft is everywhere. So what is right in the United States is certainly not what is right in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and that's a challenge we have to face, and we have to ethically decide which industries, places do we want to work. So we inherit all the regulations. It's like, you have to be right for whichever business you're in. And that is that. So when we say we need to decide, it has to be, so what is right in Europe will be different to what's right in America, to what's right in Saudi Arabia. And yes, as a technology company, we've got to engage with that. And it's hard, but actually it should be. Just because it's acceptable in the US doesn't mean it's acceptable elsewhere. And that's what's happening de facto now.
Yeah.
Is de facto now you've got, US technology companies defining what good look, and I work for one, so they're defining what good looks like, but we're saying, you know what does good look like for you in your organization? And then we can engage with you, and you say, well, we don't want to send any data outside of France, for example. It's for us to then have a conversation with you about what do you need to be comfortable to do that, and what the benefits are and what the organizations are. But ultimately, it does become a local decision. And when you get into AI, that becomes a really difficult decision, because then it's like, well, if it's a police state, then just because you say it's okay to use AI to monitor your citizens, do we as a technology company want to sell you that technology to do it? No, we don't. And so that's engagement we've got to do, because our ethics have to say, actually, I don't want to sell into an organization where, that's why you looked at a lot of the technology companies pulled their facial recognition when it was being abused. Mm-hmm. Because the ethics of, because a company has an ethical framework as well, and that's why. But don't leave it to our ethical framework. You have to have each, and it is very complicated, and it should be.
Well, it takes us nicely back to the previous conversation about defining trust in between domains. So another question from Dimitri. Thanks very much for all your questions, Dimitri. It has a large number of comments following it, so for the moment, I'll stick to the questions, Sian. Dimitri says, for the past several years, we hear companies talking about improving the personalization of their services. However, the downside of that seems to be that we are creating belief bubbles where people are getting biased information. An example would be Google Flat Earth for a week, and you'll find that your news feeds and YouTube suggestions will start to present material that is highly biased towards the Earth being flat. How can we avoid creating such belief bubbles?
I like the really small, minor topic to address there. So I think this is probably a COSAC presentation for next year, isn't it? How do we address belief bubbles? I think because
it's at least a rump session, Sian. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Because I think that is ultimately the challenge we've got at the moment, is particularly with people moving away from I hate to use the term, but mainstream media and using more social media. People are creating their little own echo chambers, and so they're getting a certain level of truth. So yes, the extreme is flat Earth, or what's the latest conspiracy theory, QAnon or something like that, where the world's being run by some cabal of people or something like that. It's effectively that is the challenge, and I think that's one of the things. This is why we need government and regulation to work together. It's like, how do we break out of it? Because unfortunately, human beings naturally have an echo chamber. Actually, it's not even a social media thing. If I'm sitting in, we have our little COSAC echo chamber, isn't it, where we sit in a group and we've got a certain belief structure that gets reinforced through that group, and actually. Well, actually, that's what makes COSAC different, is we actually challenge and query. But if you actually think about it, you get a certain. If you take class consultants in the UK who are a very specific type of risk consultant, there's a whole attitude to security and risk that is just the truth to them, right? That isn't actually conducive to a lot of what we want to do in digital transformation, and there's a real challenge. So it's even on the security side, we have it everywhere. It's a natural thing that you get, and this is why I think this habitus thing I'm just launching on, you get your own little background, connection, and the problem is you get in an echo bubble. So even if you say we're going to stop that happening from a technology perspective, there's still that fact that people are going to get into social media groups together and share things and just say this is real. The anti-vaxxers get together with other anti-vaxxers and have conversations, and so we're fighting against human nature, which I think goes back to that psychology, sociology, behavioral influencing, I suppose, rather than just behavioral analysis being a core thing we've got to do going forward.
Always comes back to people, doesn't it? Talking of the COSAC belief bubble, thank you very much for wearing the COSAC 25th anniversary shirt. Next question from David Reed. Thanks for submitting the question, David. You're on no stage this time. So do you have any experience or advice for measuring productivity versus security? I find that even affected users don't know how to measure or rate their productivity until something affects them, which makes it difficult to decide what effect a security control might have.
So, I mean, there's all sorts of productivity sociological analysis. It's like, if I'm about to do something, print something, share it, and I can't. I suppose my example was that from on a very basic thing, from that security team where they'd locked down a system to the point where the person couldn't boot it up in a really, they effectively, that's the extreme of stopping them doing their work. It's actually looking at how long does it take people to do things, are they moving around? I mean, from our perspective, it is the workplace analytics tool that we have built into Office 365 allows us to see. And when we're actually developing the security stuff that we use internally at Microsoft, we use it because effectively we're going, well, I brought in this new control and suddenly it's taking people 3 times as long to do something they needed to do, or they're not doing it, or they're behaving in a different way, or they're connecting to a different thing. And that's the challenge. So there's that sort of tooling. It is an analysis, workplace productivity connection point of view, but there's just that human report of, I needed to get this thing printed. I've got 10 minutes to do it before the system I'm printing. I'm going so old school, aren't I? I need to share this file, and I couldn't share this file because there was no way to do it. So therefore I had to spend 30 minutes password protecting it, finding a way to text the password to somebody else to allow them to be able to open it. That's very simple. You've just put friction in. So you know what? I just shoved it on a USB key and gave them the USB key, or I put it on Dropbox because that made it easier, even though it's now sitting on Dropbox where it's outside. So it's probably the next thing to look at to see if we actually can be more from a security perspective and productivity. There's a lot of IT productivity analysis, but I don't know if we've done enough about the security friction other than reporting and qualitatively people talking about it.
Thank you again, Sian. As always, huge thanks for your wonderful presentation. This goes without saying between people in the COSAC family, I suppose, but for everyone else in the room, I think it's a brilliant illustration of how even a representative of one of the world's biggest vendors can come to COSAC and actually deal with much, much bigger issues. So huge respect as always, as they say, Sian. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to move on to our next presentation. So you will once again see a display screen that says speaker getting ready. and we'll be back with you in just a few moments with Valerie Lyons. Thanks very much, Sian. Cheers.